Dr. Renee Turchi, Medical Director of the Pennsylvania Medical Home Initiative. You may begin your conference.
Thank you, Sonia. Welcome to today's webinar, Driver Diagrams, How to Develop and Display Your QI Theory, provided through a collaboration between the Pennsylvania Medical Home Initiative, one of the Pennsylvania chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics, and funded by the Pennsylvania Department of Health. This webinar is the second of two led by Dr. Rutman that aims to determine appropriate components of a key driver diagram, such as aim, primary-secondary drivers, and intervention change ideas. We will also learn how to create a basic driver diagram for a QI project and understand the importance of illustrating the theory or rationale behind QI interventions. My name is Dr. Renee Turchi, and I'm a pediatrician at St. Christopher's Hospital for Children and Medical Director of the Pennsylvania Medical Home Initiative. This webinar is recorded. The recording will be available on both the Pennsylvania Medical Home Initiative websites as well as being posted on the University of Pittsburgh Internet-Based Studies in Education and Research, ISER, website. For CME purposes, please be advised that neither Dr. Rutman nor myself have any disclosures. Please note that the information presented on this webinar is educational in nature and does not necessarily represent the views or the policies of the Pennsylvania chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics or their funders. Now please allow me to introduce Dr. Rutman. Dr. Lori E. Rutman, MD and PH, is an assistant professor of pediatric emergency medicine at the University of Washington School of Medicine and an attending physician in the emergency department at Seattle Children's Hospital. She completed her medical degree in pediatric residency at Stanford University prior to moving to Seattle Children's for pediatric emergency medicine fellowship in 2001. She has an interest in quality improvement research and is a graduate of the Advanced Improvement Methods course at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. She is the physician owner of the hospital-wide septic shock pathway at Seattle Children's and provides medical oversight for Seattle Children's involvement with the National Improving Pediatric Sepsis Outcomes Collaborative. She has published numerous QI studies related to outcomes of evidence-based care pathways for common pediatric conditions that include asthma, community-acquired pneumonia, UTIs, and acute gastroenteritis. We're delighted to have Dr. Rutman present on this timely and important topic for all of our primary care clinicians. Dr. Rutman, thank you for being with us today, and please begin your presentation.
Great. Thank you so much for the opportunity to return to the webinar series. I'm really excited to talk today about driver diagrams, and I hope that collaborative members will find it useful and be able to use these tools in your QI work. So I like starting this talk with some words of wisdom from Dr. Kaveh Shojania. Dr. Shojania is an internal medicine physician currently located in Toronto. Importantly, he's the editor-in-chief of BMJ Quality and Safety, which is a large quality improvement journal. And I had the pleasure of hearing Dr. Shojania speak at a couple of conferences, and these words really resonated with me, and I hope will kind of give some weight to the topics that we'll be talking about today. So the first thing that Dr. Shojania said was, articulate a theory for your intervention. When you're doing QI work, theory is a really important component and something to consider early on. He said, use the act of writing or the planning of writing to help inform a project's design and execution. And finally, to identify a project's Achilles heel and deal with it, don't hope that no one will notice. And I hope that by the end of this webinar, these three statements will resonate with you, and you'll sort of understand how creating and thinking about key driver diagrams can address all of these issues. With those words of wisdom in mind, we'll now transition to talking more specifically about driver diagrams. So broadly, driver diagrams are visual representations of the theory for your intervention. The theory or rationale behind any QI intervention is really critical to understand, especially when you're considering, is this going to be generalizable across multiple sites? The importance of theory for QI interventions is reflected in these quotes from Lewin and Davidoff. The quote on the bottom from Davidoff in this BMJ Quality and Safety paper is, the citation there is worth looking up if you have more interest in understanding how you can articulate theory for quality improvement work. I highly recommend the Demystifying Theory and its Use in Improvement paper that's noted there. Specifically, driver diagrams are tools for building a testable hypothesis. They define a system by illustrating what structures, processes, and norms require change in order to achieve a specific aim. And finally, as I've already alluded to, they illustrate a theory for your intervention. So many people who come from a kind of more traditional research background haven't really heard of or thought about using driver diagrams. That said, though, they are very similar to kind of a more traditional research framework or conceptual model or logic model. So when you're planning out any kind of a research project or study, you may develop a huge conceptual model to really understand how you're going to plan the study and the analysis. A driver diagram is kind of the same thing, but applied to QI work. It really clarifies the theory and informs a strategy for achieving outcomes. Importantly, it ensures that everyone's on the same page because it gives you kind of a visual map of how your project will move forward and what things you're going to try to do to get to your aim. As we'll see in one of my examples later on in the webinar, it does provide a framework for measurement and can therefore inform the evaluation of the intervention. And really important for collaboratives, especially similar to the Pennsylvania Medical Home group where you have multiple sites, if you're looking to change a behavior, to increase immunization rates, understanding how one practice may have successes, to understand if that's going to be applicable across different organizations, across different sites, across different clinics, it's really important to be able to view something like a driver diagram to see where that one clinic that had success, why they thought it was going to work, what they put into it, what drivers were really getting them toward their aim. And hopefully that will make more sense as we go through some of the examples later in the talk. So this is a driver diagram template that we'll refer to for the rest of the webinar. We'll work through each element of the diagram to really understand how you could create one of these for your own local QI efforts. To the far left of the diagram is the aim or outcome of the QI intervention. I can't help myself but to bring this back to the model for improvement. And that first question in the model for improvement is, what are we trying to accomplish? As has been discussed before, an aim statement should be SMART. So a SMART aim is specific, it's measurable, it's achievable, it's relevant, and it's timely. And having a clearly written aim statement really will define the outcome of the system that you want to improve. It'll talk about the magnitude of the improvement with a direct link to an outcome measurement of interest. It will propose a time frame for completion. And these are a couple of examples that have been seen before. So the first one was during the next 6 months, so giving a time frame for completion, a clinic's practice was going to be redesigned to obtain a 30% increase, so that tells you how much they plan to increase by, and a 50% reduction in the number of exacerbations for a pilot asthma population, and in this case, 90% of patients would be treated with maintenance anti-inflammatory medication. So the details of this are not important. What's important here is just to see that this aim is SMART. It is specific, measurable, actionable, and it has a clear timeline for when things will be completed. A simpler example, again here, redesigning emergency department processes to increase patient and family satisfaction with their experience in the ED by greater than 30% before June 2010. We'll have a few more examples as we move on. So everything to the right of the aim statement in this driver diagram really identifies a theory about what must change, and those are the primary and secondary drivers, or the key leverage points in the system, and how it must change. So those are the ideas, the concepts, the interventions that you actually want to do to get you to that desired aim or outcome. We're now going to take a deeper dive into some of the key leverage points in the system and talk about the difference between primary and secondary drivers. So primary drivers are really high-level elements in a system that must change to accomplish the outcome of interest. So this might be things like the overarching process, whereas secondary drivers are the more actionable approaches or opportunities within the system where change can occur. So that might be an individual step within the overall process. Primary drivers are intended to identify the elements of a system that are necessary and sufficient for achieving the intended outcome. And they're often kind of categorized in three big buckets. The first are the structures that comprise the system, the processes that represent the work of the system, and then the operating norms or the culture of the system. I will say that operating norms or the culture of the system is often one of the most important and most overlooked drivers that need to be addressed in order to actually get change to happen. So this is stuff like, provider buy-in that something is important, or patient belief that something is important. It's buy-in from leadership at the top that, this is something that the group really should focus on, and that there's support from an institution for this work to move forward. So the culture of the system can be really, really key, and some of the biggest impacts can be found when the culture of the system is addressed. We'll take a deeper dive now into structures. So the structure might be the physical design of a space or a product. It might be some technological elements or equipment. It could be the overarching department organization, the leadership structure. And just to go back to this slide for a moment, the technological elements and equipment might be things like the EMR, the electronic medical record that your institution uses. The physical design of a space could be something, if you were looking to improve, say, clinic flow, perhaps redesigning where certain people are seated or how the clinic space is actually designed might be one approach that you took to achieving your outcome. Leadership structure and things like that are often hard things to change, but they are things that you can address kind of leadership structure with some of your interventions, and we'll get to that in the future slides. Processes, on the other hand, are things like system workflow, how things are accomplished, what steps are taken, and in what order. And these processes are a very common target for improvement projects, which makes sense. These are the things that we can more easily manipulate. As I alluded to on the prior slide, it's often hard to change the leadership structure of your organization. You can remain cognizant of it, but it's not something that you're going to change, whereas the process, the way patients flow through a system, the process for intake in a clinic, the process for following up on missed immunizations, those are things that we have control over and can change, so they're really common targets for improvement work. They're also often the easiest to measure, which is important as we're thinking about kind of future iterations of improvement efforts and learning from our past efforts. And finally, operating norms. So as I mentioned, this is the culture of the system. These are the written and unwritten rules that govern the behavior of the members of the system. Might also be called organizational psychology. And again, I can't emphasize enough that these are really critical elements to consider when you're introducing a change to the status quo. So any quality improvement effort, any improvement work is going to be a change, and humans tend to be reluctant to change. So just considering how you're going to address those cultural aspects when you're introducing something new is really, really important. We're now going to talk a little bit more about secondary drivers. So secondary drivers are actionable approaches, places or opportunities within a system where change can occur. So another way to think about these are the switches within a system that must be flipped on or off to achieve the outcome of interest. And they're a little bit more refined than the bigger conceptual primary drivers we just talked about. So this may be like, rather than just thinking about the whole EMR that a clinic is operating under, it might be just replacing a tool within the electronic medical record, or introducing a new step to a process. So it's not the overall process, but it's the single step within a process that really is going to be what you're addressing, or reordering the sequence of events in a process. I do want to say here, because I've given this talk several times, and people often get very hung up on, oh gosh, this is so complicated. Is this a primary driver or a secondary driver? It often doesn't matter, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, but secondary drivers might actually be unnecessary if the aim is to improve a single process or a step within kind of a microsystem. When you're looking to do broader QI work, say across a whole network of institutions or across many aspects of a hospital system, it's useful to divide drivers into primary and secondary drivers because these projects can become very large and very complex. On the other hand, if you're just looking at improving a simple aim within your clinical practice and it's sort of unidimensional, you often don't need to tease out, is that a secondary driver or a primary driver? Remember here too that the point of driver diagrams, these are supposed to be useful tools. So getting caught up in the weeds of semantics between primary and secondary drivers is frankly not worth it. The tool should be useful to you and to your group as you move forward on your QI effort. So to emphasize that again here, really the distinction between primary and secondary drivers might be unnecessary if the aim is to improve a single process or step within a microsystem. And as I just mentioned, the drivers can be lumped into just drivers or split into primary and secondary drivers if that makes it more useful to you. So to the far right of the driver diagram are the ideas, concepts, and bundles that might generate the desired state. So these really are, what are your intervention ideas? We're going to work through a lot of the semantics here and sort of defining change ideas and change concepts. But similar to the primary and secondary drivers, these are your interventions. And you can split them out if it makes it useful to you, or you can just say, I have an aim or an outcome, I have drivers, and then I have interventions that are going to impact those drivers to get me to my aim. So specific ideas and concepts. Change ideas are tangible and specific, and a single idea may affect multiple drivers, whereas change concepts are abstract forms that underlie the change ideas. And to give you an example of that, if I wanted to increase the reliability of writing for 20 minutes a day, so if I really want to get my academic work moving forward and I want to just say I'm going to work on a manuscript and do some writing for 20 minutes a day, and I want to think of some interventions that might help me with that, a change idea would be to set an ongoing calendar reminder that's going to buzz every day to remind me that I need to write. And then the change concept would be just the concept of reminders, that reminders might be a useful way to get me to remember to write for 20 minutes a day. So again, these things often get lumped together. You may have a very specific change idea, or you may just have kind of a change concept that goes into your driver diagram that you further tease out as you go through your PDSA cycle. To kind of segue into that thought, a driver diagram is most useful when it depicts a theory that can be tested empirically. So the model for improvement and PDSA cycle, seen here on the right, really provide the mechanism for testing and learning from and then revising all the predictions that you laid out in the driver diagram. So these things are really importantly linked together and should be used in conjunction with one another. So we'll now take a deeper dive into a couple of specific examples of driver diagrams. I hope this next section of the talk will really tie together some of the abstract concepts and get you thinking about how you could apply driver diagrams in your own QI work to improve adolescent immunization rates. The first example is a very simple one from the IHI, or Institute for Healthcare Improvement, on improving body mass index. Okay. So in this example, the aim was to reduce my BMI to 28 or lower by some date. So here it was in 2012. The primary drivers that they identified in this case were calories in and calories out. The secondary drivers for calories in were things like prepared meals versus fast food meals, alcohol consumption, protein, carbohydrate, and fat content of food, or the consumption of sugary beverages, whereas the secondary drivers that would impact calories out were things like how much time was spent doing cardiovascular activity, how intense was exercise, and what was the metabolic rate from increased calorie burn. So again, this is a very simple example, but interventions that would impact secondary drivers that would impact calories in would be things like minimizing fast food meals at home, or minimizing fast food meals and eating at home. So that would impact how many prepared meals versus fast food meals were eaten and would impact calories in and would hopefully lead to a reduction in BMI. So this is a very sort of unidimensional key driver diagram where each intervention impacts a specific secondary driver that is related to a specific primary driver that gets to the aim. You will often see, and in future examples, you will see that some of the arrows leading from interventions to drivers can, one intervention could impact multiple drivers within a key driver diagram. But I hope that this sort of laying it out in this very simple format gives you a sense of how you read the driver diagram and how you think about things going from your interventions, why you think your interventions are going to work, what drivers you've identified that are going to really bring you to achieving your aim. I did also mention earlier that driver diagrams can be very useful tools for determining what you need to measure as you're pushing your QI work forward. So measurement, remember, plays a key role in any QI effort, because if you're following certain metrics, certain measures over time, you're going to know if your interventions are working. So here, this is just an example of what kinds of things may be measured as this person was trying to improve their BMI. So they could measure the percent of meals that were fast food. They could keep a weekly count of how many alcoholic drinks they consumed. They could do a daily count of how much soda or juice they drank. And so these are all that you can imagine as you were to put this together for your own projects, how you could think about, okay, if this is one of my drivers or if this is my intervention, how am I going to measure whether or not these things are actually being followed and whether or not these are the things that are impacting my aim. The second example that I'm going to share today comes from some work that we did here in Seattle to improve sepsis screening in our emergency department. So for a bit of context, we've been trying to standardize the recognition and management of sepsis in our emergency department for the past few years. As noted in my intro, I lead the sepsis pathway here and also our work with a big national collaborative to standardize sepsis care across children's hospitals. And so we've really been trying to increase our screening of patients who are at risk for sepsis in the emergency department. And unfortunately, our electronic medical record does not allow for fully automated sepsis screening. So many places have just kind of a roving screen that looks at patients' vital signs and labs and then gives an alert if the patient is at risk for sepsis based on those objective data. And we don't have that capability in our EMR here. So when we started screening children for sepsis in our emergency department, it was really on the nurse to take initiative and fill out a screening tool when he or she was obtaining vital signs. And so we looked at our data to say, how are we doing with this? This here is a statistical process control chart, or SPC chart, that shows the proportion of patients who were febrile when they presented to the emergency department, who were screened for sepsis at baseline, just when our improvement work was starting. So as you can see here, we were at 5 to about 15% of febrile patients were being screened when they presented to the emergency department, and we had tremendous opportunity for improvement. If we really wanted to screen, you know, patients with fever are probably the most simple group who's at risk for having infection, and we would imagine screening most of those patients to pick out the few that were really at risk for sepsis, and we had a lot of opportunity for improvement. So with that in mind, for this project, we developed a SMART aim to increase the completion of ED-based sepsis screening tool in febrile patients from the baseline that you saw on the previous slide of 5 to 15% to greater than 50% over the next 3 months. And so you may ask, you know, if we go back to my prior slide, my goal was 90%. I felt all of these patients really should be, almost all these patients should be screened. But when you're thinking about actually doing QI work, you need to take small steps and think about, a priori, what is going to be a realistic level of improvement that I can expect in a shorter time frame. So this project was really a 3-month goal, and there's no way we thought we could get to greater than 90% in 3 months. So small steps and iterative change, knowing that the first change you make is probably not going to be the final change, and allowing the project to kind of evolve and develop over time. So this is our key driver diagram for our sepsis screening project. As you can see here, our SMART aim that I just outlined on the prior slide is there at the far left of the driver diagram. And then our drivers were lumped. So this was a simple project in one emergency department. I didn't really feel like it was necessary conceptually for me to break this down into primary and secondary drivers. So I categorized these things as I described the primary drivers earlier into structures, processes, and culture. So the structure here that really was at play was our IT structure. So the screening tool was a power form, which is just an electronic form that a nurse completed when she was doing the intake vital signs. And the clarity or ease of use of that power form was the key structural element that was identified by the group to be playing a role in whether or not patients were screened. The process driver was also really important for us to consider, and that was related to what happens with a positive screen and huddle. So we recognized after spending some time with nurses and spending some time kind of on the front lines when patients were coming in through the emergency department that nurses often felt that when a positive screen was obtained, a patient screened at risk for sepsis, they were supposed to huddle with the supervising physician team, and often they just didn't know what to do with it once they got a positive screen. They didn't really know if the huddle was supposed to happen. There was sort of inconsistent uptake of people like talking about it or using the sepsis pathway if a patient was at risk for sepsis. So the process really needed to be addressed. And then linked to that was the culture. So provider, meaning physician or nurse practitioner belief, and nursing belief that the screen was something that was valuable. So there's no way you're going to convince nurses to do an extra step in a process if they don't believe that it's an important step. They have so much to do already when they're intaking a patient in our emergency department, so asking for one more form to be filled out was not going to happen unless they thought it was important. And linked to that, if the providers on the receiving end of the positive sepsis screens didn't believe that the score was valuable or valid, there was no way that they were going to react to it and respond to the nurses when they came to them. So those were the drivers that were identified as leading to, the key elements that we were considering as we thought about the interventions that would bring us to our aim. And then on the right side of the driver diagram here are all the interventions and ideas that came up through a series of brainstorming meetings. We have a core group that's leading the sepsis effort for our emergency department, and so that multidisciplinary group had a series of meetings where we really thought about what are the things that we could do to impact these drivers to improve screening. And so it was everything from modifying the actual power form, and there were some specific things that we changed on that to make it more user-friendly. Improving the process for what happens when a screen was positive, and also doing some low-fidelity simulations of what happens when you have a positive screen to understand where the breakdown was in that process and to hopefully learn from the simulation and improve the next stage. And then the cultural aspects were addressed by a lot of kind of in-person education, discussing septic patients that were missed at safety briefs, getting patients and families engaged in the process so that they were asking providers about sepsis to sort of remind them and cue the interest. So all of these different interventions and ideas were things that were considered. Many of them were tried and tested, but not all. And it was, again, done in a very iterative way with a PDSA cycle ramp where each time we tweaked one thing or another and wanted to see how we were doing in terms of our outcome of screening. And here's a sort of the next stage in that SPC chart, looking at the proportion of febrile patients who were screened in our emergency department. So as you can see here, the chart is annotated for all the different things that were happening along the way that might have had an impact on our sepsis screening process, from implementing our first septic shock pathway back in 2015 to revising the power form, to joining this big sepsis collaborative and having a second round of revisions on the power form. This got us for a couple of months above our goal of 50%, but still we found that after we had that initial bump in screening, we were not really sustaining our gains. And again, we were starting, though this wasn't yet meeting special cause variation, we were starting to drop off again, and screening was not consistently being done greater than 50% of the time. So our final intervention was in May 2018. We changed the form to an opt-in rather than opt-out, and the screening rate as of September has been 98% and sustained. So again, multiple iterations over time to really understand what is going to drive us toward achieving our aim or outcome of improved screening. So the final example that I'm going to share is another brief one, but I wanted to share it here because I think it shows how driver diagrams also make their way into publications and can be a very useful way to illustrate the theory and context for improvement efforts if your work becomes more academic and you publish the work that you're doing. So this is a key driver diagram that was published in this quality report in pediatrics back in 2014. The group here was looking to improve and standardize care for diabetic ketoacidosis, and one of their secondary outcomes was to improve hypokalemia incidence by 25% by the end of the second year after they implemented their DKA pathway. So again, you see that there's a SMART aim. They have what they want to do, by how much, by when. And another example here of lumping their key drivers. So they have their key drivers listed, and it's very simple, kind of a shortened version of their design and change concepts. So this probably was not the driver diagram that they were using when they were actually doing their QI work, but they were able to kind of clean it up and hone it down to something that could convey the theory for what they were trying to address and why they thought their interventions were addressing those drivers when they wanted to publish this work and spread it to other institutions. So piggybacking on that last example of a driver diagram in publication, I'd like to wrap up today's webinar with some thoughts really on the utility of driver diagrams if and when you're considering publishing a QI manuscript. So the Squire guidelines, this is really just kind of a teaser to the Squire guidelines. For those of you who have never heard of them, they are kind of a framework for reporting new knowledge about how to improve healthcare. And they're intended for reports that describe system-level work to improve quality, safety, and value in healthcare, and that use methods to establish that the observed outcomes were due to interventions. So really, for those who have read studies before, like the consort is kind of what you use if you're doing a randomized controlled trial, and Squire is what you would use as a framework if you were writing up a quality improvement type project. There's an entire talk that I could do on the Squire guidelines, but I wanted to just, again, give you a little teaser here to say that the guidelines suggest that when you're writing about quality improvement work, a description of the rationale for the QI intervention really deserves its own section within the manuscript. So this is pulled directly from the Squire guidelines, and as you can see, they describe the section of the rationale to be the informal or formal frameworks, models, concepts, and or theories that were used to explain the problem, any reasons or assumptions that were used to develop the intervention, and reasons why the intervention was expected to work. So, taking that and thinking about driver diagrams and what actually gets put into a driver diagram and how it's displayed, I hope adds more sort of credence to the idea that a driver diagram could be a really useful tool, not only as you're planning to do a QI improvement project, but also as something to reflect on when you're writing about the QI work that you've done and thinking about what was the rationale, why did I think this was going to work, and what was my theory. So clarifying rationale really elevates your QI work. It specifies all the proposed relationships to be tested and guides the assessment of context. So is this generalizable? And again, similar to what I mentioned earlier about driver diagrams, if you can look at the driver diagram from one clinic's successful QI intervention, you can it will help you understand, do the same contextual elements apply in my clinic? Is this something that, are these drivers relevant to me, or do I have a completely different system where these drivers do not relate to what I do, and therefore these interventions probably would not be successful in my setting? The rationale also aligns with the measures that are used, and as we discussed with putting the measures or metrics directly on a key driver diagram, you know what you need to measure when you've clearly thought out what you're doing and why. And so if you have a good rationale for your work, what you should measure to understand if your work is successful will become more clear. And rationale really can be the theme that ties QI work together and also that ties the manuscript together. So in summary, I hope that I've convinced you that driver diagrams can be a really useful tool for defining your system by illustrating the structures, the processes, and then the culture or the cultural norms that may require change to achieve your specific aim. They also can be really helpful to illustrate the theory or rationale for your intervention. And finally, they can assist in translating your QI work and the great projects that you're doing into QI research and publication if that is something that is useful to you and of interest. I'd like to end with a few resources that I think I mentioned at the end of my last talk with a couple of additions. So the Improvement Guide is a great book as sort of a general introduction to quality improvement. The Healthcare Data Guide, again, is the book that will help with statistical process control. Quality Improvement Through Planned Experimentation is a book that helps think about other ways to design QI studies. And then the IHI Open School is a free and easily accessible web-based learning tool that I highly recommend. The example of the BMI driver diagram came from the IHI website, and also they have many kind of short YouTube-style videos just going over some of these key QI concepts. So as a refresher or just a reminder, I think that it's a really great resource. And then the Squire guidelines, which I started introducing at the end of this webinar. Squire has its own website, and so if you're thinking about writing up a QI project, or even if you're just looking for some guidance on how to organize a QI effort, kind of reading through the Squire guidelines can be very helpful because they were designed not only as a way to organize a manuscript, but really to be used proactively and prospectively as you're planning any QI intervention. So thank you. And I am definitely happy to open this up for questions.
I just wanted to say thank you so much for your webinar, and I had a quick question for you. If you could ask, in your experience with QI projects and using key diagrams, I think you gave us some really great examples today of some high-level projects that have been published, and that was really helpful, I think, for us to see that. I was wondering if you could talk at all, as you know, our practices here on the call have done some projects related to, it's a certification project on adolescent immunizations and well visits. So a little more straightforward, not, really high impact, but very much smaller. And I wondered if just to sort of think about applying that to the work that our practices are doing, sort of if we could maybe just, have you had any experience doing key driver diagrams with things like improving well visit rates or immunization practices, and if that was anything we could just, talk about for a minute and share some of your thoughts on applying the key driver diagram to the work that our practices are doing?
Yeah, I think there are certainly, that's a great question. I think there are certainly applications of using a key driver diagram, one for the, the project as a whole, looking across all of the sites, but also I think smaller kind of improvement efforts within individual practices. So, knowing what the baseline immunization rate is and what your goals are helps you write a smart aim for the project at large. So, we aim to increase immunization rates of adolescents presenting for well child visits from a baseline of 30% to 80% in the next 6 months, right? So if that's, say, the aim for the whole collaborative, individual practices, understanding what their baseline is and where they may be able to improve to individually is kind of a great place to start. So writing that clearly written SMART aim, and then thinking about, across the whole Pennsylvania Medical Home group, there's clearly big drivers that would impact what would get you to improving aims. One of them, if you think about kind of the culture of the collaborative and all of the sites, one part of the culture is, belief that MOC is important and a cultural commitment to doing quality improvement work. And so an intervention that the collaborative is doing is having webinars like this where you're learning more skills to do QI work, and that will hopefully in the end bring you closer to your aim of improving immunization rates. But I could imagine even a smaller driver diagram in a single practice where if your clinic, say, is looking to improve well child visit rates, like if getting more kids immunized means getting them in for their adolescent well child visit, then are there certain drivers that impact that aim, like the availability of clinic visits or transportation for your patients to visits, or every clinic will have its own things that can help them address the drivers that really will ultimately bring them to their local aim of improving immunization rates. So I think there are many applications for key drivers, and just thinking globally for the whole initiative, but then also within each individual practice, there can be hundreds of key driver diagrams that are all kind of trying to strive for the same ultimate aim.
That was really helpful. Thank you. It was great to kind of hear your perspective and some ideas.
Hi, Dr. Rutman. This is Eileen. We have a question. Somebody is asking, when you have your chart and you have your aim and your primary drivers set up and secondary drivers, how long do you initiate and continue with the interventions before you need to change into the second drivers and alter that? They just don't know, you're in a practice that's busy, you don't have a lot of time, you don't want to keep going down the wrong road. So is there a guide as to how much time you continue with an intervention before changing the driver?
Yeah, that's a really great question. That comes up all the time, and the answer is it depends. So it depends on what the intervention is and how you've set it up from the start. So for some of these interventions, you may decide that and you can decide this a priori. You may say, we're going to try this intervention for 1 week, for 1 month. You kind of set the cycle time. And then importantly, just having some way to measure if that intervention is doing what you want it to do. So maybe it's a month, maybe it's 3 months, depending on kind of how frequently events happen. But if you're setting it out from the start, measuring whether or not that intervention seems to be having an impact, and when it's not, then reacting to it and changing your mode. I will say that if you're looking at your data on say a run chart, which is just a very simple line graph over time. So say you were measuring, the proportion of your adolescent patients who presented for well child care over, a 3-month period. You really need, if you're looking at a run chart, you need to see kind of 6 points in one direction or another to know if you're seeing a change. And so you think about the way you kind of subgroup the way you're collecting your data. So it might be that you measure this as a weekly measure, and after 6 weeks, you're going to be able to kind of look over time and say, okay, I've got now 6 weeks of data. How am I doing? Has this intervention actually impacted the proportion of my patients who are coming? It may be that, your clinic is really busy and you have a huge adolescent patient base, in which case you could measure it daily, and say after 6 days to a week and I've done this new process change, how has it changed things? So it's kind of, this is where your local expertise about your problem and the frequency of the thing that you're trying to improve, how frequently it happens, will determine how long you should cycle through each intervention before you switch to a new one.
Thank you, Dr. Rutman. That was a great webinar. I want to thank you for your excellent presentation. We're going to wrap up our webinar, and I want to also thank the Department of Health for the funding that made this webinar possible. This now concludes our webinar.